Today's Thinking Thursday is going to be about Carl Friedrich Beyer, who later became Charles Beyer as he naturalised into the UK. He was born in Plauen in Saxony on the 14th of May, 1813. And we're going to follow his journey as well as tapping into a little bit of the journey of his partner. Firstly, I want to give a bit of context to him. So he came from a family of hand loom weavers. That means a non-automated form of weaving for clothes and fabrics, and he would go on to look into automated loom weaving. So his mum thought that he would grow up to be an architect because when he was a child he would draw and build miniature buildings, and then when he was 12 he got a tutor in maths and geometry and drawing, which is kind of perfect for what he potentially would grow up to do. And then he actually had a drawing in the house, and when a family doctor came to visit, the doctor was so impressed by this pride of place drawing that Carl had done that he actually got Carl a place into the Dresden Polytechnic. What an amazing family doctor. That's incredibly generous. So then Carl went to study engineering and architecture at the Dresden Polytechnic, and he graduated. He did really well. He was a great study, and he graduated in 1834. And then he got this massive stipend to go to the UK to bring back information and kind of report on the automative machines that the UK was building for cotton spinning. So specifically in the world of textile making. The UK was kind of making these really big innovative moves in automated manufacturing of cloth. And so Carl was given a load of money to go over to the UK and kind of suss out the machinery that was being used there. And so he went to Manchester, and he specifically went to a company called Sharp, Roberts and Co. And they were making these massive machines for cotton spinning and loom work and all this kind of stuff, as well as on the side they were making locomotives. When he went to the company, he was super impressed, and Richard Roberts, one of the partners in the company, just really impressed him, and Carl began to kind of idealize him. There is a rumor actually that Carl had a bit of a crush on Richard Roberts' daughter. Not proved, but that might have been part of the reason that he was so keen to go back there. So he basically gathered all this information that Sharps, Roberts and Co. were using and reported on all the machinery that they were making, went back to Germany, handed off all these reports, fulfilled his stipend, did great. He immediately hopped back to Manchester and Sharp, Roberts, company, can I have a job, please? Carl was well trained in being a draftsman, so that's kind of what he was pushing for. And Sharp said no, because at the time, foreigners were not really respected in these kind of companies. So Sharp felt like if they introduced a German into the workplace, the other staffers would not really get on with him and wouldn't really appreciate having a foreign co-worker. Sharp offered Carl a sovereign in kind of place of saying, no, you can't have a job. And now for reference, a sovereign was 20 shillings, which is technically £1, like a pound of the day. So £1 sterling of the day. But what that translates to is about 3 weeks of wages. So that's like £800 today. So imagine going to a job, being rejected, and them offering you £800. I think I would have taken it, but no. Carl was like, it's work that I want. That's an actual quote. He replied, it's work that I want, and rejected the sovereign. And Richard Roberts was so impressed by this that he actually hired him as a draftsman. I don't know whether Carl was planning for things to go that way, but clearly that was a very effective way of going about the job interview. So he starts working as a draftsman there, and he was actually paid less than the UK staffers. So even though he was well qualified, extremely good at his job, he was paid less. I guess it's kind of a way of appeasing the UK workers who felt uncomfortable about a foreigner coming into their institute. Not fair. I don't support that. Carl was extremely good at his job, and he actually applied to become part of the Institute of Civil Engineers and was rejected because of his status as a foreigner. So then in 1846, he got together with Richard Peacock, Heinrich Dubs and Charlie Geach to make their own kind of institute. They were like, well, if you're going to reject us, we're going to make our own. So they formed the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. And the first meeting was actually held at Carl Friedrich Beyer's house. He had a 6-story house, which will be an important thing that we come back to later. They actually went on to form a company themselves. Carl became a partner in that company, Beyer, Peacock and Co. of Gorton. And this is like a really important company for locomotive engineering. So Sharp, Roberts and Company were making not just technology for manufacturing, but they were also making locomotives. And gradually through Carl's time there, he had become a draftsman for locomotives. So by the time he was making a company of his own with Richard Peacock and others, he was also designing locomotives. And this is where he really flourishes in his career. So Beyer, Peacock and Co. were making mostly locomotives, but these locomotives are kind of world renowned. And this is because they are some of the longest lasting and most well made in the world. He did actually join the Institute of Civil Engineers in 1852 once he'd been naturalized into the UK. Probably for the sake of networking, but I think I would have been a bit bitter, been like, I don't need you, I've made my own institute. Shame that the bigots got him in the end. So in 1846, Richard Peacock, Carl Beyer and Co. of Gorton are starting to form their own locomotive company, and the Swedish state wants to build their own railway. So they have this guy called Gustav Theodor Stieler, who is their lead buyer for carriages and locomotives for the Swedish state. I think I have found an article or a newspaper clipping from the 15th of November, 1846, that references Gustav Theodor Stieler as a deputy chief engineer. I mean, he could have just said that to a reporter. And this was in an article about like civil and commercial and I think even criminal engineering, but I'm not sure. It was a Parisian article, but I found it's such a small segment in like an almost unreadable piece of newspaper. So I'm not 100% certain about that. But I think he has a history in engineering too. And that becomes referential because he does actually complain about being overlooked in his work by the Swedish state railways because he is just a buyer. I mean, being a buyer on an international market is a huge responsibility, but he, I think, is a buyer who had a history in being a deputy chief engineer. So he's well qualified for the job. But basically, in the 1850s, the Swedish State Rail is looking all around the world for locomotives and carriages, and the kind of place to go for trains is the UK. And so Gustav goes to Carl and says, Sweden needs trains. You make trains, make us a train. In 1856, there's this really important purchase that happens for kind of train history, that Gustav Theodor Stieler commissioned a train called the Prince August, named after one of the Swedish princes. And it becomes the longest working steam locomotive that still runs today. It's a really impressive machine, very graceful. But I did actually spend hours researching how a steam engine works, and I think I can kind of summarize it basically in the fact that you use a massive heat source, so coal, to create a big old fire that's very contained, and then it heats water around it to this very intense pressure, and then the pressurized steam is projected all the way to the front of the engine, and then it uses a piston. It basically has like this sort of pin thing that shifts back and forth with these spurts of steams, and then it shoots a spurt of steam on one end to compress a thread that's connected to a wheel. So it compresses this way, and then as it rotates round, that's what causes the rotation. So this is straight, but it's rotating on a wheel. But then the piston is pushing steam one way to force the pressure to shove the pin this way, and then it squirts steam the other way to force it to go back. So you have this, but it's going. That's a very, look up videos online, but basically this movement means that the wheel at this end, I don't know whether you can see that, but the wheel at this end is kind of making this motion, and it can go in reverse and do all sorts of things by changing this. I'm not going to explain it. I'm going to leave beautiful videos, wonderful explaining videos online to do that for you. But essentially, it's really impressive technology. And the fact that they can basically contain this unbelievable amount of power in a machine safely with a guy literally sitting behind this like bomb of powerful contained energy, and just do that for his whole career is just so impressive to me. I'm completely lit up by the ingenuity of these people. So for me, Carl is a hero just by working in that field, just because like trains are so impressive. I can totally see why people get fanatical about steam trains, because they're really profound pieces of human inspiration. The longest running working one is the Prince August, that was designed and delivered by Carl as commissioned by Gustav Theodor Stieler. Now, the thing about Gustav is that he and Carl ended up in a relationship. And so I want to give you a little bit of history about Gustav and Carl and something that they had in common. Not just the fact that I think they both spoke German, but also the fact that the two of them very much idealized older men, like to quite an extreme extent. Carl's kind of considered to be bisexual, and he had quite an idealistic relationship to the men that he admired. But he was also extremely intense about his work. And there doesn't really seem to be this element for Carl that he like misses socializing. He does kind of come across as a bit autistic, which, to be honest, sounds amazing and perfect for the field that he was in. But he does admit later on that he will work himself to the point of being unwell and that he just doesn't take rest. And he actually spent days designing the handles to go on his desk drawer, to the point where he would miss all other social activities just to keep perfecting the design of the handles on his desk drawers. In the letters that are shared between Carl and Gustav, there's like a sense that Carl is he comes across as quite stoic, even though he does seem very, very emotional and like engaged, and he can be really passionate, and he does express his passions and his amour towards Gustav. There is this kind of sense that he can be read as a little bit stoic, even if he's not actually meaning to come across that way. So one of the things that happened that caused a bit of a breakdown between the two was that Gustav, having, I think, a background as a deputy chief engineer, felt overlooked in his work for the Swedish State Rail, being just a buyer, and he felt like he wasn't really perceived for the talents that he had. And Carl responded being like, don't be silly, you're talented, you're wanted, just chill out. That was received by Gustav as being a bit dismissive. And then Gustav just kind of stops talking to him. And Carl does write to him saying like, I really miss the letters, I really miss talking to you, I want to see you again. But Gustav is a bit sour after that point. But their relationship started in an era where it was still very much illegal in the UK for homosexuality to exist. It was punishable by death. The last execution was in 1835, and they got together in around 1855, 1856. Been about 20 years of this not fully enforced death penalty, but definitely a high stakes notion of this is very illegal for homosexuals. And then in 1861, it was reduced from a death penalty to 10 years to life if you were caught in homosexual acts. So it was really not safe for them to be open about their relationship. And part of the reason that I think perhaps they might have been or at least Carl was on the neurodivergent perspective, was because he's very unabashed about his desire for Gustav and what he wants from Gustav. And Swedish Rail Museum actually has the letters where in autumn 1857, Carl wrote to Gustav saying, I won't allow you to go into lodgings again and make us both miserable by having to part late at night. I wish you were here in my bed. That's quite significant given the fact that Carl had a 6-story house. So if he's having to share a bed with Gustav, it's not for practical reasons. So there is like a very open expression of intimate intent there. And I think that's really beautiful that he didn't feel oppressed by society to hide that. Or he wasn't more cautious about that. I think that can be part of the superpower of being on the neurodivergent spectrum, is you just can be more open and honest than people who are more controlled by the social norms around them. In 1857, after this letter, The two end up living together in Manchester, which is really sweet. So Gustav moved into Carl's 6-story house and they were living together as a happy little gay couple. And then Gustav had to go back to Sweden to do more train shopping and assessing the needs of the railways there. And this is where Gustav sends a letter to Carl saying that he feels really overlooked by the Swedish State Rail, which makes sense if he was a deputy chief engineer previously. But then Carl responds saying, you're talented, you're wanted, you're good, don't worry about it. And I think there was just a level of stoicism that Carl had that was kind of received as a bit dismissive. And then Carl just is like, no, I'm not talking to you. He just becomes super sour and doesn't talk to him. And Carl writes letters saying like, I miss the letters, I miss connecting, I want to see you again. And he's just like ignored until they kind of sort of start connecting again. I think they may have actually like spent some time together. But then there's another souring because Carl's relationship to work is really his primary love. Carl is just completely enamored with draftsmanship and engineering, and the fact that he really isn't willing to put anything above that has an effect on the connection of the two. But also that Carl was deeply religious and he considered himself to be a sinner because of his relationships. At the end of Carl's life, he becomes extremely philanthropic, and he actually remains the highest donator to the University of Manchester, still to this day. And he also set up 3 parishes. He was deeply religious. And I hope that his generosity and his donations and his founding of these parishes came from a place where he felt grounded in love and compassion, rather than the concept that potentially he was trying to make up for a sin that he had incorporated from the social norms around him and from the religious texts that he was reading. So I really, really hope that those benevolent acts were coming from a place of self-love and communal value, rather than trying to cleanse the soul somehow for a narrative that was made up by the society around him that homosexuality was a sin. These two didn't end up together at the end of their life, and that might have been because of the religious texts and impacts of the social surroundings that Carl was under. And I think he may have found grounding and comfort in his parishes because he could have a safe connection with others that was maybe more understandable because everyone was reading from literally the same songbook than if he was to be kind of more vulnerable and emotive. And just a lot of the concern that he had was about being understood and perceived correctly by other people. Whereas, in fact, I think he might have been happier if he had a supportive society around him where he could just be openly expressive of who he was without feeling like he could only connect with society if he had shamed himself into correctness. So I hope that his benevolent acts came from a place of self-love and adoration for his community, rather than trying to somehow cleanse himself for being a sinner. And in fact, I don't think that would have been the case because he became quite polarized in his older life. He became very much a high Anglican and anti-Catholic. And I think a lot of it was due to the fact that being vulnerably himself wouldn't have been accepted in his society, whereas pushing very much into the narratives of the community around him in religion, where everyone is literally reading from the same songbook, gave him a sense of safety and social connection, because he couldn't be wrong if he was literally quoting the same text that everyone else was reading from. So I think if he had been given an opportunity to be in a society where the nuances of his passion for work and his relationships had been more accepted, then he wouldn't have become so polarized about his religious perspectives and his political views. But he was very successful, and he ended up living in a very fancy hall in Wales at the end of his life. I'm going to just write it here because Lord knows I can try to pronounce it, but I would butcher it. We'll put the name of it here. And he died on the 2nd of June, 1876. What I want to focus on with his life is the fact that, firstly, steam engines are so awesome, and that we should really just continuously celebrate the fact that the Prince August train is still running, which is just a huge feat of engineering. I think we should take recognition of the fact that when foreigners come and join a company, they should be accepted with open arms, because sometimes they will go on to make the world's longest lasting and most effective form of the thing that that company is creating. I really hope that we can take Carl Friedrich Bayer's biography as an example of the fact that we should be more accepting, tolerant, welcoming of foreign workers, and that they can be a point of pride for our country, whether they naturalize or not. I hope that in the future, the Institute of Civil Engineers just welcomes foreign engineers just because they might be equally as amazing. And it doesn't really matter where you were born. That's not a sign of whether you're talented or not. And I would also like to point to the fact that people who are living in a time where homosexuality was not only not accepted, but criminalized to the point of the death penalty, might have missed out on parts of society or groundedness in their life simply by the social pressures that they were under to deny a part of themselves or hide an experience they were having. And I wonder if Carl might have had a more open and free and sociable life later in life if he'd just been able to feel more accepted by the society around him. So Charlie Beyer, or Carl Friedrich Beyer, and Gustav Theodor Stieler, I hope that their story goes on to inspire other people to be more open about their relationships and to feel more confident in being foreigners in the workplace.